Probably this girl, to whom this story will be told, was the only one in this world who was able to see her own funeral. And so, when she saw her dead and breathless body in the coffin, it was only at that moment that she realized that she was really dead. The girl decided at that moment that the god must have decided to play a joke on her, and the joke turned out to be very cruel. However, sometime before, the girl had been lying in her bed, and as soon as she woke up, she immediately started coughing. A maid came running to her, who brought her a glass of water and turning to her, told her that she should drink the water slowly in order not to choke on it. The maid was very concerned and said that she had no idea how the mistress would even eat in such a terrible and weak state. The girl was really incredibly weak. She had severe bruises under her eyes, and she had lost a lot of weight since she had gotten sick. The girl sipped her water and said that she would be able to eat. However, her voice was so quiet due to her weakness that the maid could barely hear it. This girl was the only Archduchess of the Ronta Empire, namely Adriana Svantravica. And just as Adriana was about to take another sip of water, the maid yanked the glass from her hands and said in a gruff voice that she highly doubted her abilities. She said that if the girl was so weak and couldn't do anything, she should skip the meal. However, Adriana was indignant and said she could eat a light soup that she could handle. The maid nudged her partner and said she wouldn't allow it, because last time the food had spread all over her clothes and even the bed. The girl asked Adriana if she had any idea how hard it was to clean. The mistress answered nothing. She only sighed heavily. In fact, absolutely everyone in the Ronta Empire knows that the Archduchess has health problems. And the Archduke turned his greatest attention to her immediately after the girl's debut, and the decision to marry was made quite quickly. However, Adriana's weak health deteriorated day by day, and they still could not enjoy the life of newlyweds, because the Archduke concentrated on carrying out the Emperor's tasks. And from this whole situation, the girl's sense of loneliness only grew more and more with each passing moment. She felt lonely and unwanted by anyone in this world, because the closest person who should love and support her is almost never around. When the maids took the tray of food away, one of them said that the Archduke had sent special gifts for her. Adriana was very surprised to hear this, and asked what other presents she had. Then the maids pointed to a place where there were many boxes of various things. The maid explained that he had already returned to the capital. However, His Majesty the Emperor had ordered him to come to the palace immediately, so he couldn't come to see her. The girl was even more upset when she heard this, and asked if it was possible that he wouldn't even come to the mansion. An aide who knew all about the Archduke's affairs also came to her and told her that another urgent meeting had been appointed after the audience. He also said that the Duke was only in the capital for one day, but he would tell her when he returned. Adriana coughed, and wiping her mouth with a napkin, thanked Sir Zimsker for this information. In fact, the girl missed her beloved Noah incredibly much on such hard days. And so, at night, as Adriana lay there gaining new strength, she felt someone's heavy hand on her head. Because of this, the girl immediately woke up, and when she saw the man, she was incredibly surprised. Her unexpected overnight guest was the very same Archduke Noavian Trevica. The man, seeing the look in Adriana's eyes, suddenly became worried and said that he didn't really want to wake her up. The girl began to sit up on the bed and asked him when he had arrived, for she had asked him to wake her if the Duke appeared. Noah fixed her hair and started moving the girl closer to him. He put his arm around her and told her he'd just arrived. Adriana felt the warmth of his body and closed her eyes and said she missed him very much. The man kissed her forehead and told her that he really did too. Noah couldn't believe he could be around her and said he missed her incredibly much. Then they lay down together on the bed, for the girl felt too tired and began to talk. The man said that the servants were also very worried about her health and asked if she was taking all her medicines. Adriana said of course she wasn't missing anything. They were silent for a while, and the girl clasped her hands together, afraid of something. When Noah noticed this, he said she could talk if she needed to. She hesitated to say it for a while, but then she dared and said she couldn't stay like this forever. The man leaned closer to her and said that the whole empire knew she was in very poor health, and people were much kinder than she realized. Adriana waved her head and wondered if it was true, since even at home she was considered worthless by everyone. That is why she concludes that people outside the mansion can't treat her any better, if even her own servants show her no respect. Noah, seeing her concerned look, said they would cut off the head of anyone who spoke ill of her in any way. The girl was incredibly grateful to him for such care and support, but she wished she could somehow repay him for it all. They talked for a while longer and so on and lay down to sleep. But Adriana did not sleep that night. She loved the lullaby that Noah sang to her, as well as the nice pat on her shoulder as a sign of reassurance. It was what made her feel like she was feeling it all for the last time. The morning was proving to be a restless one. It was just beginning to dawn outside the window, and the maids were already shouting throughout the mansion, telling them to call a doctor as soon as possible. Adriana woke up and started coughing up blood. She even fell off the bed, for she tried to do something about it. The maids were holding her in their arms when they came running to her. One of them ordered that medicine be brought to her quickly. The girl who lay on the maid's lap between expectorations of blood did not really think that this medicine could help her in any way. She was soon brought the special medicine she always drank when she had such attacks, and the maid said it would stop her bleeding. Adriana listened to them, but what she really realized was that that time really was the last time she would be able to see her dear Noah. While the medicine was spreading down her throat and then going inside afterward, the girl thought about how incredibly sorry she was that she wouldn't be able to see him again. And Adriana wanted so much to spend as much time as possible with her lover, but at that moment she felt as if she were drowning, even though there was no water anywhere near. For a while the girl plunged deeper and deeper into the darkness, but then suddenly began to wake up, thinking that it was just some kind of dream. Adriana felt some more pain and weakness in her body. She tried to get up but couldn't, and only rolled over onto her other side. She felt the headache become much less, and soon it was gone altogether. And for the first time the girl was able to rest and gain strength so well. The maid approached her and told the girl that she had to go out anyway when no answer came. She asked if the mistress was even listening to her. Adriana remained silent. Then the maid couldn't stand it any longer and addressed her in a more elevated tone. She called her mistress, for crying out loud. The girl jumped up on the bed. When she saw the maid, she was a little surprised and asked if it was really Annie. The maid didn't understand what the question was about. Adriana was a little concerned and said that she couldn't have aged that fast after all, and wondered if she was their new maid. The maid was very concerned, and then said that she didn't know what kind of Annie. She asked if she was going to go already. Adriana was surprised and asked where she should go already, but the woman calmly replied that they should go to the funeral, for the Archduchess was dead. The girl, hearing this, thought about it and realized that she was, after all, the only Archduchess of the Empire, and this frightened her a little. After thinking for a bit, Adriana had no way of knowing why she had to go to the funeral or how she could have died in the first place. Soon the girl came to a small table on which were many different newspapers, with headlines everywhere stating that the Archduchess of the Empire had passed away. The girl could barely stand on her feet because of the strong shock. And then she asked herself how it could have happened. The maid continued to insist, and said that his lordship the Archduke wanted to know if she would come to the funeral. Adriana immediately turned to her side and asked if her husband really wanted to know. The maid laughed and replied that it was now possible to become his wife. The Archduchess of Trovic was dead, and his beloved could take her place. Adriana had no idea what she was talking about, but at that moment she suddenly got severe headaches, and images popped up in her head. Some give her medicine. The girl doubted it, but apparently it was indeed true. Were the memories she had periodically, this was not a nightmare, but a reality. The maid, seeing her condition, said that the funeral would be in the afternoon, so she'd better eat first to regain her strength. She also added that during this time, even sleeping would not be a strong problem if a girl so desired. Adriana went to the mirror and began to examine her new appearance. She realized that her nightmares were reality, in which she eventually died, and found herself in the body of her husband's mistress. Soon the girl was brought a lot of different flavored food. Looking at it only, she realized that it looked incredibly delicious. Adriana felt drool filling her mouth, for she was eager to taste it all and eat it already, and she wondered when she had last had such an appetite. The maid, who was bringing more and more food, asked if Mistress didn't want but. Adriana immediately interrupted her and said that she did, and that she would eat. Well, then she suddenly turned to her and asked her what her name even was. The maid looked at the mistress in surprise and asked if she had lost her mind. But the girl only replied that apparently she is the kind of person who makes unpleasant faces and says very rude things even to people who are higher in status. That's how at breakfast the maid, who introduced herself by the name of Marge, told her that the girl had been hysterical and crying for days. Adriana managed to find out that this body belonged to Countess Bleer Acacia. The girl also remembered that she knew Count Acacia well. He is actually a gray-haired vassal of the Archduke, who is not capable of holding a high position. He married a young girl, but she did not know about it, because she was ill and missed almost all the events that took place in the Empire. Adriana thought at this moment that she and this girl together were similar enough that such a coincidence only spoiled her mood. After a brief silence, Marge suddenly spoke up and said that in any case, if Madame was going to go crazy, at least let her do it nicely. Adriana, upon hearing this, was very surprised and asked what she even meant by that. However, at this moment, the maid suddenly got up from the table and said that she was very pleased to see that she was eating well, so she would bring something else. Adriana still didn't understand what the phrase similarity of mind had to do with it, but she decided it would be best not to say she was an archduchess, or she would be in big trouble. The girl had almost finished this soup that was in her plate, and looking at the half-empty dishes, she thought about the last time she could eat with her own hands. When the girl was finally full, she leaned back against the back of the chair and realized that this body was very much a healthy body, and it would probably play to her advantage. After a while, a man suddenly entered her room. When she saw him, she realized that he was the servant sent by the Archduke. The man looked worriedly at Adriana and asked what he needed to convey to his lordship. The girl at this point thought hard about whether she would attend the Archduchess's funeral. She found it hard to believe that Bleu had really been her husband's secret mistress, and the girl, averting her gaze, asked that he tell her that she was still thinking about the proposal. Shortly after breakfast, Adriana went to her room and sat down to read the newspaper to keep at least somewhat up to date on the news. At this time, the maids were peeping at her through the small open door. They couldn't believe that the mistress was actually reading the newspaper, but her partner said that it couldn't be, and it was probably some kind of catalogue. One of the maids also said that it was the first time she had seen Madame so calm and even modest. At that moment, however, their gossip was suddenly interrupted by the voice of Marge, who came up to them and sternly told them to get on with their work. After that, the maid went inside the room and closed the door behind her, sighed heavily, and the maids apologized to her and immediately ran away to go about their business. At that moment, Adriana turned to Marge. The maid looked at her worriedly and realized from her voice that she was going to ask her some strange question again. In fact, before that, the girl had already managed to ask if Marge was her babysitter, as well as where the Countess was, and what her name was in general. All of this was very frightening to Marge, but then she gathered her thoughts and asked what she wanted to talk about this time. And if the girl kept this up, the whole empire would think she had lost her mind. Then Adriana put the paper aside and asked if she was really Noé Ventrovich's mistress. The maid, when she heard this, was very much surprised, but then she quickly went up to her mistress, and glowing with joy, asked if she had really decided to admit the truth. Adriana was a little surprised and asked what other truth. The maid leaned close to her and in her ear, and asked if she and the Archduke had such a relationship. Then the girl quietly inquired why she suddenly thought so. Marge replied that she had been interested in the Archduchess very often, and she thought that only a mistress needed such a thing. She asked in surprise if she was capable of being a mistress, but Marge replied that of course she was, because she had received jewelry and a dress from the Archduke himself, and you don't do that for nothing. Adriana said that now everything was clear to her, but the maid smiled and said that she could not hide it and speak very frankly, for there was nothing to be ashamed of. Marge added as she walked away that they were not each other's last, and she could tell at least her. The girl put the paper aside and said that she wasn't sure about that after all. Adriana stood up from the table and thought about the fact that no one else would be able to answer her question. So she told the maid that she would first accept the invitation and go to this funeral. The girl realized that she must meet Noévian in person. Soon the maids brought her a funeral dress, and even in black Adriana looked simply irresistible. But when she saw the maids, She realized that they were all very tense when they were around her, and assumed that it was likely that Bleer Acacia was even angry. When the preparations were finished, Marge came running in and told her that the carriage was already waiting for her downstairs. Her dress was simply gorgeous, and the girl was fully prepared to go to the funeral. Adriana was soon downstairs, and while she rode in the carriage, she looked out of the window and thought of the fact that she and Bleer had quite similar looks. And also, this girl has incredibly excellent health. She reflected on the fact that she is now in the status of a mistress and thought it was even funny. She realized that the owner of this very case was having an unusual relationship with her own husband. Of course, at first, Adriana just couldn't believe it. After all, he didn't have time to date because of his work. Well then, it remained a mystery to her what could possibly bind them together at all. Soon the carriage pulled up to the event and stopped. The funeral had already gathered quite a number of nobles to escort the Archduchess's final journey. Adriana stood at the very back, so no one would pay attention to her. And watching it all, she wondered if she was even a good person. After her debut, she was immediately married and locked up, and because of her illness, knew almost no one. The girl came closer and closer to her coffin, and realized that everyone was mourning for her, as if they were close acquaintances. But she finds it all strange, and doesn't believe that these people are really sincere. She looked at the poor woman with closed eyes, who was dressed in beautiful clothes. All these actions were very similar to the funeral of the Retina Empress, who had left this world while she was still young. And now, as she stood looking at her dead thing, Do realized that she was indeed dead, and that meant Adriana was gone. Soon there were whispers of people saying that the Archduke had arrived. Many people were afraid to imagine how hard it was for him, for it was his own wife. Man, as he approached the coffin, immediately saw the girl there, turned around and saw his face tired with sadness and grief. Apparently he was even crying, for his face was just as swollen. She looked at his face and realized that he was right in front of her, and she was alive standing next to him. Right now, however, the man was mourning for her. But just from another body, it was hard for the girl to realize it all. Adriana moved closer to him and was about to say something, but when she saw the tears on his face, she realized it would all be unnecessary. The girl wanted so badly to hug him and comfort him. But at that moment, Noah passed her, catching her with his shoulder. He was on his way to see his dead Adriana. As the man approached the coffin, he put his hands on the glass. They trembled. He was truly in mourning for his dead beloved. His legs would no longer hold him. Then he fell to his knees and cried loudly because he missed him so much. Blee moved further away to avoid causing him more and more pain and just watched the whole thing. At that moment, a blonde-haired guy suddenly walked up to the coffin. It was her brother, who also had many tears in his eyes, and he turned to Noah, shouting and asking him to save Rihanna, his little sister. The girl, watching it all, couldn't look at it all anymore. It was too hard to realize how much they were hurting. Adriana cried and thought about how if only they could call her by her name, and not that lifeless body, it would be so much easier. But she was well aware that such a thing would never happen again, because everyone she knew thought Adriana was dead, and purely technically, that was indeed true. Quite a few hours had passed, and the guests had dispersed to their homes to insult alone, and the girl stood not far from the cemetery, near a tree. Adriana knew it was stupid to just stand there and wait like this, but she knew he was definitely coming back, so she stayed. The girl looked at her tombstone, which had her name written on it, as well as the fact that she was the mistress of the Northern Trophic Territory, the daughter of the Eastern Primate, as well as the fact that she was simply asleep, resting in this place. It was hard, but she wanted Noah to come now more than ever. It had been a long time. The night was still going on, and Adriana was about to leave. But then suddenly she heard a clatter from hooves, and when she turned to the side she saw a man. At last she thought at once, it was probably Noah, because she was far enough away. She couldn't see the man get off his horse and walk over to someone else. The ignorance was outright killing Adriana with curiosity, but when she looked at the back of her head, who realized that it was definitely not Noevian. But then the girl didn't realize who. She was very curious about the mysterious man who came to her grave in the middle of the night. Adriana moved closer to get a closer look at him, but the man must have noticed someone coming and became wary. But then he shifted his gaze to the tombstone, and as he came closer to it, he fell to his knees due to intense grief. With a trembling hand, the man ran his hand over the words that were written there and could barely hold back his tears. It was too hard and painful for him. Adriana had no way of knowing who had come in the middle of the night and was so very sad for her. She stood watching all this for a while, and then realized that apparently he knew Adriana very well, but she couldn't say anything to that. The girl decided it was best to stay out of her sight, so she would just leave. As soon as she started to leave the cemetery, she heard the man call her by her name, Adriana. He turned and stared for a while at the surprised girl, who was looking at him. She herself saw someone else's blood on his form, and it even scared her a little. She assumed it might be his own blood. The man tried to get closer, but then suddenly felt a sharp pain, so he stopped. Adriana knew she had to get away as soon as possible. The girl knew that she should not meet anyone, because she did not look like she was used to being seen. So she started to run away. But suddenly the man started to call her by her name again, Adriana, and asked her to come over. She wasn't listening, and all the while, without stopping, she ran toward the manor house. As soon as she got home, she was met by Marge, who said worriedly that there was something wrong with Madame's legs, and it really was. Due to Adriana really rushing hard, she even lost her shoe in the process, so her pantyhose got a lot of wear and tear. Marge turned to her assistant, Iona, and asked her to treat Mistress's wound. She agreed at once, though she was a little concerned. The girl sat down on the couch for the maid to do her work, and realized that fatigue had come over her immediately after she got home. The whole time Jonah was working on her feet, Adriana's head was ready to explode with all this train of thought. She thought about the fact that not only had she become possessed by the body of her ex-husband's mistress, but some unknown man had appeared at her grave, grieving and missing her. She remembered the face of this stranger and realized that if it hadn't been for him, she could probably have even met Noevian, for he would surely have come there. Soon Marge came to her and brought her a cup of tea, and then, looking anxiously at the lady, inquired whether she had managed to meet the Archduke. Adriana didn't immediately answer her question, but when she asked again, she said that she had seen her, and thought to herself that they hadn't even gotten to talk, not just stare at each other for a while. And after that, he pretended he didn't even know her. It looked like they were in different worlds now. That's why she couldn't do anything, just hid and cried. The hardest was, of course, Noevian, who lost her and had to communicate with all the mourners who tried to support him, but by doing so only made things worse. The girl could not even believe that she had doubted him even for a moment, but she did not know what to do now, for she had nothing left at all. Marge continued her questioning and asked if she had seen the Archduchess's body. The girl only replied that she had seen him, and remembering her own face, she realized that she was much prettier than she had been when she was sick or they were in bed. Nothing else bothered her, and her face had finally taken on a peaceful look. But it wasn't until she saw her dead body that she realized that she could never go back there, and she could never get her old life back either. And now Noevian, who had not spent even 2 days with her during the whole time of their marriage because of all his urgent business, then all ready to remain near the body 100 days, in order to fulfill the duty of the Imperial family. As Adriana sat and drank her tea, she came to the conclusion that this whole situation was even amusing to her. Well, at that moment she was approached by a maid who looked at the girl in surprise, and said that she had not expected that the mistress could even cry at such a thing. In fact, Adriana didn't even realize that she was suddenly in tears, and she didn't feel any sadness. It just seemed very strange to her. The girl thought about the fact that she had gained a very healthy body, but lost everything else. And everything would be much better if this whole situation turned out to be just some fairy tale or a typical romantic story. So, as Adriana sat there thinking about all sorts of things, a maid suddenly came running in to tell her that something had happened. The girl, worried, looked at the maid and asked what was wrong since she was so excited. The maid came closer to her and handed her a small letter. Adriana was a little surprised, but she took it. When she opened the note, she saw that it was Noevian's handwriting. It told her to keep her promise. There was no doubt in Adrian's mind, because she had seen this handwriting countless times, so it was definitely him. And so, while she was reading the note, another maid suddenly came in and said that a man had come to see them. He wanted to know who had attended the Archduchess's funeral. Adriana immediately turned to her and asked her what she had said to that. The maid said that she had been told that they were not looking for her specifically, but for anyone else present, so she said that she had to find out first. After that, she would tell them exactly what they were looking for. The girl was satisfied with that answer, so she thanked her and said that in that case she would go out herself and explain everything to them. And suddenly Marge turned and asked if by any chance she knew who might be coming at this late hour, and then suggested that she should go herself and tell them to wait in the reception room on the first floor. The girl, however, refused to do so. She waved her head and replied that it would be best for everyone if she went and met with them herself. And so, as Adriana walked downstairs, she thought of only one thing, that it was definitely Noah who had come to her. Of course, just the mere thought of her lover waiting behind a closed door pleased her to the core. And soon the girl began to open the doors, hoping to see Noah now. But he wasn't there. There was some man with bright red hair standing right in front of the girl, and Adriana concluded that it was definitely not her lover. Some more time passed from that moment, and the man returned to another guard, saying that a maid named Marcia, she was at the Archduchess's funeral. At this time, a fair-haired man, who was bandaged all over because of his wound, sat in the carriage and listened attentively to his guard. Guy recounted his conversations with Adriana and said she didn't remember seeing His Highness there. Then the man suddenly couldn't stand it and started climbing out of the carriage. The guards immediately became wary and started stopping him, asking what he was even doing. One of them also asked that the man should just admit already that he had his eye on this girl, and then it would be easier for everyone. However, the man only waved them away, asking if they were crazy. The man didn't understand how they could have imagined such a thing. But the red-haired man blocked his way and said that the girl was already very frightened. She thought a scary spirit in bandages from the graveyard had come for her. When the man heard about the summer, you wondered who he was talking about. And the boy explained that he had not seen a ghost, but a very pretty and shy maid. At this point he frowned and asked how the guy even dared to call Adriana a ghost. The man immediately bowed and, apologizing, said he had made a mistake. But then suddenly another guy stood up for him and asked him who he was even looking for. The gentleman waved them away and said they didn't need to know. But the man still insisted on his own way, and after apologizing to His Highness, he said that if he saw his appearance from the outside, he would also be very surprised. And the man's appearance was really not the best. His whole chest was bandaged with a dirty bandage that was covered in blood, and his clothes were all torn. The red-haired Neil immediately said that of course she was scared of him then, because when she noticed those red eyes, she straight up all tensed up. The man thought about their words for a while. After that, he agreed, saying that they were right, so he suggested leaving already. But before he got back into the carriage, he said they should definitely keep an eye on this woman. However, at that second he suddenly felt a strong pain in his body and could not stay on his feet. The man fell to the floor, bleeding again. Neil immediately ran to his aid. Then the other also picked up His Majesty's and said that they would return to the palace, and he should stay behind to carry out His Majesty's orders. He put himself and the gentleman into the carriage, and then ordered the coachman to rush to the palace as soon as possible, and the carriage immediately started off. I, in turn, was left to stand in the same place and look at the gentleman and his assistant. Before the man left, the sweetheart suddenly noticed tears in his eyes, and this guy was very surprised by it. He did not know that His Majesty was capable of such feelings. In fact, that blonde-haired man with ominous red eyes was the second Prince of Rhodeness. He was the prodigal son of the Emperor, who says with a nonchalant face, "I'll show you more when a woman pulls up her skirts," the most troubled man in the Empire. And despite all his shortcomings, the man was still incomparably handsome and crazy. When he took on something, he was sure to see it through to the end. And in the morning, he wreaked incredible havoc on his estate. As soon as he heard the news, he headed out the door bandaged. Then Neil anxiously ran after him and asked if he was sure he was all right. But the prince replied that he was fine. The boy insisted and said that he had almost been killed by a monster, and he didn't understand how he could be all right after that. Neil examined him and said that he had a very serious wound, so it should be treated very well first. However, the prince replied that it was fine. he wasn't going to waste time on it. He wasn't really surprised by this behavior of the prince, for it was very much like him, and he decided that since there were no plans for this day, he would be sure to do what he had planned for the next day. And just as he was about to relax and go about his business, he suddenly heard some loud screaming in the room next to him. Without concluding that something was wrong, so he had to go and check it out, he entered the room. He saw the gentleman standing there. He said he heard a scream and also asked if there was any problem. The prince held his sword in his hands, as well as the shirt he wanted to throw over his shoulders. Neil, seeing the girl sitting next to him, said that he didn't know he suddenly had some kind of appointment. His Majesty looked rather alarmed and said that he actually didn't know that someone would be there at that time either. The attendant took a closer look at the woman and realized that she was the daughter of nobles, and then sighed heavily and concluded that the prince was still just as popular. But at that moment he put his dagger to her throat and told her to leave as soon as possible. The girl replied in a shaky voice that she just wanted to hand him the newspaper, but at that moment he clipped a few hairs from her head and asked if she was deaf, if she didn't understand the first time. Soon after the prince dealt with the rascal, then Mill still made him renew his bandages before he went somewhere. And so, while the man was dressing his wound, he asked if he was sure he didn't need to do anything about it. I mean, there are bad rumors about him already. So something like this could make it even worse. The prince held up his newspaper and said, sighing heavily, that he didn't really care about any of this. However, as soon as he read the headline, he was very surprised and asked what it was about. Neil, who had already finished dressing, said that it was a brand new newspaper. The headlines of this newspaper contained the shocking news that the Archduchess had died at dawn of a chronic illness. And as the prince read all this, he wondered more and more. After he had read that paper a few times, he just sat there silently looking at her picture in the front pages. But shortly afterward, he ran out of the palace and, taking his horse, jumped on it at once. Neil shouted to him that if he moved so much, his wound might reopen and he would bleed heavily. However, he certainly didn't listen to him and went on to his goal. Neil, who remained seated in the castle, was very surprised, for he had never seen His Highness cry over someone's death. So he assumed that the Archduchess must have been too close to him since he was so accepting of it all. However, Neil, who was left to spy and get all the information he needed for the prince, concluded that first he really needed to try to find out everything about the girl named Marge. The next morning, Adriana awoke early enough that a maid came to her immediately, holding her washed linens. The maid asked her mistress where she should put it all. She was dressed in a modest but incredibly beautiful pink dress. When she saw that she was holding clean laundry in her hands, she said she wouldn't need it in the living room, so she should just put it away. After that, Adriana ordered some more maids to clean out all the unnecessary things from the parlor, and Marge, who came in near the end of the job, said that the atmosphere was much nicer now that she had gotten rid of all the unnecessary junk. In fact, the girl was thinking about the fact that they must have been missing someone to run things at home all this time. That's why it was such a mess. At that moment, however, a butler suddenly came in to see the girls. He turned to Madame, asking if she could help him with some questions. The man was very worried because he wasn't used to her being able to manage things at home, but said that it was originally the Earl's job. However, he was not present at the moment, and the job still needed to be done. Adriana thought for a moment. After that, she decided she might as well help with it after all. Then the girl, along with the butler, began to decide some matter that was written on the paper, while Marge watched the whole thing with a smile on her face. After that, the senior maids turned to everyone else and suggested that they hurry up and finish already, so that Mistress would be satisfied. Adriana, when she finished helping, watched the maids do their work even with a smile on their faces. The girl came to the conclusion that now everyone else was finally starting to feel more comfortable. Of course, she doesn't know what will happen to her in the future. However, she wanted to get along with all these employees and didn't want them to think she was some kind of arrogant person. Soon, when all the chores were done, Adriana went outside for a short walk. She was holding the note that the maid had recently given her. She wondered what Noah and Blue had in common, a question that had plagued her since the day of the funeral. And she was also worried about that carefree note that told her to keep her promise. It made it hard for her to understand what their relationship was. Adriana suggested that Perhaps Blue was just a close friend to him, but quickly dismissed the thought, for he had always been alone and trusted his feelings to no one. Then she thought of the fact that this girl could be his relative, for Noevian is a member of the Imperial family, in which case Blur must also belong to that noble family. That thought might have had some weight, but the girl realized that she would not have married the weak and old Earl of Acacia in such a case. So the most obvious thing Adriana had was the idea that they were just friends. Soon afterward, Blur returned to the castle and found the library nearby. As soon as Marge went in there to clean up, as she always did, she was surprised to see the girl behind the book, and asked if she was really reading. Adriana said she was, and the book was incredibly interesting. The girl got up from the table and, putting the book aside, said that there were also many other interesting books in this study that she would like to read more. However, after seeing their reactions, she concluded that Blue had never done such a thing, so they found it somehow strange and even frightening. At that moment, Adriana wondered if Noevian, the man who had been the best student at the academy, would ever get involved with a girl who didn't even have a book in her hands. So it didn't make sense, and he and Blue were definitely not friends. The girl at this point walked over to the lake and stared into her reflection for a while, trying to figure out what she should do next. Adriana, seeing the dark-haired and green-eyed girl in the water, concluded that she was quite beautiful and very similar to her true body. After some more thought, the girl thought that surely Bleu must have been rather foolish, for she had married an old count, couldn't or didn't like to read, and made herself look bad all the time. Adriana got to her feet and realized that this couldn't go on any longer, and she absolutely had to make some changes in her life and find out as soon as possible what the promise was even about. For if it didn't matter, Noah would never have sent her the note. The girl decided that she would find him first, because there was no point in sitting around waiting for him to contact her. It might take a long time. But then suddenly Marge came running out to her. She looked very worried and ran straight toward the girl. She stopped near the lady and said that the master had returned. When Adriana heard this, she was immediately alarmed, realizing that it was Count Acacia. But then suddenly she realized that he was the one who might also know about the promise. So this news didn't upset her too much. At this very time, Count Acacia was standing in his office, just staring out the window. Adriana, as soon as she heard that he had arrived, went straight to him. After a quick knock, she entered the room and turned to the Count. The man, who was quite a bit older, turned and saw his wife and said hello to her. He looked at the girl for a while. Then he said she had come after all. For quite some time they just stood there looking at each other, an awkward pause between them. But shortly afterward the man ordered that tea be brought to them, and pouring a drink into a cup for her, asked if she had met the Archduke. The girl watched him for a while. Afterwards she said that she had not met him yet. Count Acacia was a little wary, and afterward he asked if she planned to keep the promise she had made to his lordship. Adriana was immediately wary. She knew he knew something, but she didn't understand why he was making that expression. So the girl decided to ask right away what the promise was, so as not to beat around the bush. At this moment, Duke Acacia suddenly sat on his knees and turned to his wife and asked that they save him. After all, he does not want to die an unworthy death. He really wants them to keep their promise. The girl became very worried and told him to get off his knee. However, the man did not want to obey her. He continued to sit on his knees and said that while all the people of his age were living a quiet life, he was still working under the Archduke. Adriana moved closer to him and asked him to get off his knees now. But the man continued and said that the Archduke was not the most gracious, and she should know that very well. The girl was very surprised. She looked at her husband, who was trembling with fear, and did not understand why he suddenly made such a fuss. She had just asked about the promise. The girl kept coming closer and closer to him, and said she was curious to hear it from him herself. Count Calcium held his hands to his throat and asked if he gave her consent, would his title remain. Adriana thought back to that note, realized that things were getting more and more confusing each time, and she still wasn't getting any answers. At this point, the Count suddenly shouted and said that he didn't want to be a part of all this anymore. He just wanted peace of mind. He doesn't want to stand between them, and asked why she agreed to this ridiculous sham marriage in the first place, and then inquired of him if she had done so in order to legally become his lordship's sweetheart. The girl was shocked when she heard this. She couldn't believe that Blue could really take such a desperate and terrible step, and Noah had cried so convincingly at her funeral. Her hands suddenly began to tremble because of anger and the news she had heard, and the girl realized that she was his mistress after all. Soon the prince, when he began to feel much better, he came straight to the Archduke's side to meet him. Prince then turned to him and said that he had heard that some useless act with the name of victory ceremony would be held. The Archduke at this point interrupted him and said that they congratulated him on his victory, and the latter in turn asked if he would grace the event with his presence. When the latter remained silent, he said that he had won a victory on the battlefield that he had prepared for him. Therefore the prince also added that he would be very disappointed if that man did not show up. Noah was just silent for a while, and then said in a sad voice that as he already knew himself, he was in mourning right now. The prince was silent for some time, and the Archduke went on and said that he must see his wife off on her last journey, so he was leaving the palace for that time. After that he turned around and started to leave without even saying goodbye to his guest. The prince in turn told him to accept his condolences. He was very sorry for what had happened to the Archduchess, but Noah paused for a while. However, he answered nothing to that. Then the prince smiled and asked if he didn't want to do it. The Archduke gradually began to turn around towards his guest. Afterward, he smiled lightly and bowed in respect. Neil, who was standing behind the prince, suddenly moved closer to him and said that he thought he had already expressed his grief. However, the prince objected and said that he had not seen the body in person. Therefore, that incident does not count. Soon they arrived already at the palace, and Neil said that apparently the rumors of his visit had already reached even the Archduke's ears. But the man started to walk away and said he didn't care at all. So the guy started to catch up with him, because he hadn't said everything yet. When His Highness stopped, Neil said that the Archduke had not let anyone near the Duchess since the first day of the funeral, and he told His Majesty that he could not put the body on display. He smiled and said it was quite a strong act on his part, and he was even romantic. However, he wondered how long it would all pour out, since even Empress Retina had gone through the procedure. In fact, according to this procedure, the funeral of members of the Imperial family, including the Archduchess, lasts 100 days, and it's an old tradition. Her body is not buried yet, but just lying in that very glass coffin. Neil walked straight behind the prince and said that they would prepare everything if he suddenly wanted to formally express his condolences. However, the prince replied that there was absolutely no point, and when the guy heard that, he was very surprised. The man explained that there was no way that idiot was going to show her body. Neil wondered what he meant by that. The man didn't want to discuss it all and asked that he send an invitation to the stupid victory ceremony at the Acacia Count's mansion. Neil was silent for a while. After that, he said that he didn't think he would come, because he was the Archduke's vassal. He thought about the fact that a man could not appear at such an event without the Lord's permission. The prince went higher and higher up to his room and said that he had heard that the mistress of that house was a young girl, which meant that she was coming with her maids. The boy, when he heard about it, was very surprised. Then he asked if he was going to meet Lady Marge in this way, but he could not understand why the gentleman needed a maid of Acacia County. The prince said nothing to this. He was only thinking about his own thoughts and was not going to justify his actions to anyone. It had been several days since Count Acacia had returned and told her of his promise, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. She spent all those days in the mansion and did not even go out to the streets to recover from the shock. Adriana lay on the bed most of the time thinking about the fact that the girl whose body she was in now wanted to be Noah's legal mistress. And there's a ridiculous tradition in this society that you can't make an unmarried girl your mistress. And Adriana thought it was completely stupid. She soon sat up on the bed and realized that her whole head was filled with thoughts of Noevian. So she decided to go for a walk, at least during this time. Well, as soon as she was about to get up, she suddenly saw not far away from her What Also magazines. The girl immediately opened them and became interested in the topics they described. Adriana had read about the trendy brands of dresses and hats that would be able to charm even him before the ball to honor the victory of the second Prince of Rhodes. When Marsh saw her reading these journals, she said that all the talk was only about the second prince. and even though it had been a very long time since he had left the capital. In fact, the prince is the kind of man who prefers to earn achievements on the battlefield. They have such celebrations, he doesn't like all that bragging. Before long, one of the maids suddenly knocked on the room, and Adriana immediately allowed her to enter. When the maid came into the room, she turned to Madame and said that she had been told that the dress was ready and had been brought directly to the mansion. The girl, on hearing this, was very surprised and asked me what other dress I was wearing. She, the maid, said it had been altered right on her instructions. Adriana at that moment remembered walking into her dressing room and seeing a whole store full of clothes and realized that she already had a lot of outfits, and she didn't think it was necessary to buy another dress. And some of these things hadn't even been worn yet, so no one had seen them. However, at that moment, the maid came closer to her and said that she was talking about wanting to make her debut this season, right? Adriana immediately got out of bed thinking of the debut, and then asked if she still hadn't had one. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise, but said she had said so herself. The girl was still very worried, and then she wondered if she wasn't 22 years old now. The maid said that's right. That's why she was upset about missing her debut last time. The girl then decided to quote her words and said that if something went wrong this time, she would burn the mansion alive. She then said those words directly to the Count's face. At this moment, Adriana outright blushed. She was actually embarrassed about the whole thing, even though it wasn't even her own actions. And the girl herself wondered what this woman who was in this body was even thinking. And it wasn't at all like her roots were from a noble family. She looked more like some commoner with her actions. After recovering a little, with the girl sitting back on the bed, she wondered, where is her dress now, in that case? Soon the maid asked Mistress to change, and they went straight to the place where her dress was. As soon as Adriana arrived, she immediately picked up a piece of paper and began to peruse the assortment. She asked the consultant, "Are these emeralds top of the line?" The man was incredibly afraid of blue, so he stood away from her and said in a trembling voice, "That's right, that's exactly the right kind of emerald." Soon he handed her the slip of paper. With the check for this dress, the girl began to scrutinize it. The salesman himself looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was even looking there. After all, she would probably take him at his word, as before, that all the jewelry in the store was of the highest grade, even though that is absolutely not the case, and he's charging just like he did for them. Adriana, who at that moment was scrutinizing all the details about her dress, was incredibly surprised. She didn't understand why the order form and the dresses didn't match. It made her even more angry that he had chosen the most expensive one. The girl scrutinized again the store and the dress she was to pick up. Then she turned to the salesman and said that he had done a very good job. And at the end she added the nicest line and talked about how he had done a brilliant job of not looking like a fraud in people's eyes. Adriana then walked over to the dress, and pointing to the gemstones that were on the necklace, she inquired, "Does he really mean to say that this cheap emerald can be like the highest class?" The man bowed and said he was only in the transportation business, so not in the sense of grading. Adriana immediately smiled and asked, "Is it really true?" She began to move closer to him and said that if so, she could explain everything to him clearly and in detail. The girl got level with the salesman and looked him straight in the eye and told him to look at her and not to avert his lying gaze. She pointed her finger at her eyes and said that this is what the color of the highest quality emerald should be. It really was. Her eyes sparkled like the most expensive emeralds on the planet. In fact, the girl grew up without a mother, so she learned to pay attention to many things. One day she went to a store and was told that she had to look carefully to find jewelry of the highest quality so that she would not be fooled. When her mom was still alive, she said she could tell. Look in the center of the gem. And it should never be forgotten, because she may need it in her life someday. Adriana needed to prove her dignity every day. That's why she had to put in more effort than others. So now this situation was pissing her off. She sighed heavily and looked at the salesman and said that she just couldn't believe him, and thought to herself that it was incredibly ignorant to try to sell this unsightly thing he called a gem. The girl thought about how Blue always asked for the most expensive things. Even because of her pride, she wasn't going to check them out. and this salesman had always profited from her. At this point, the man realized that he urgently needed to rectify the situation somehow, and he said that there seemed to be some mistake, so he would bring another dress right away. However, Adriana refused him and told him that it was not necessary. At that moment, the man's eyes lit up with joy. He thought that surely she was going to forgive him, and he was so relieved. The girl said that the things would be bought at the amount that would result after revaluation, and she expected a personal apology from Madame. When the salesman heard this, he was very surprised. He did not expect the girl to ask exactly that, because in fact Madame knows nothing about his dirty deeds. He decided to salvage the situation somehow, and said that it was all his fault. So he asked to just limit the punishment to just him. The man also added that he would talk to the jeweler and the worker who picked out the jewelry, and they would make a beautiful new dress for her. At that moment he thought about whether this woman had always been so intelligent and attentive. However, Adriana said she has no complaints about the dress. She just wants him to give her back the difference in cost. She will continue to do business with Rabelais, but lost trust is not as easy to regain as he thinks. Adriana also said that if Madame was very busy, and she arranged a written apology. The maids who came with her were very surprised, and such a reaction they did not expect. That a girl could stand up for herself like that? When they returned to the manor, the maid turned to the march and asked if she had seen the expression of that worker at all. The head maid exhaled with relief and said that it had been a sight to behold. Then the girl turned to the lady and said that if she did not like the dress, she could send it back to buy a more luxurious and expensive one. Adriana thought for a while, but then said that right now, such a dress would attract completely unnecessary attention, so she would decline such an offer. The girl also said that she doesn't feel like it at all. Therefore, it would be enough for her only to show her face. She herself at this moment thought about the fact that Adriana's face could not be seen by many people, but she would be able to run into some acquaintances who might see familiar features. But at that moment she suddenly felt the maids' gazes on her face and turned around to see their frightened faces. Mistress asked why they were looking at her like that, and herself at that moment suggested that they must have thought she always wanted to be the center of attention. Marge didn't answer her question. She said it was time for them to get back to work. But Adriana, as she looked at their faces and realized that it said it all at once there, then she suddenly shifted her gaze to a dress that was standing nearby, and said that this outfit kind of fit. When the girl tried it on, she asked if it would be too revealing for a debutante since there's a bare back. The maid agreed and said it was certainly open, but it was her type, so it wouldn't be a big deal. Adriana was glad that she could finally find an outfit, and said that this way she wouldn't be inconspicuous, but would only attract all the stares. But the maids protested and said that if she liked it she should wear it, for she herself said it was a sin not to flaunt such beauty as she had. Adriana, hearing this, was very surprised. But then she realized that it had been completely different before. Closer, therefore, said that perhaps that was what she had been saying. Well, the girl knew that she would have to go to this feast anyway, just to at least meet Noevian there, for he was bound to come then. She was silent for a while, and then she said that it seemed like the victory ceremony would be a very good chance for her debut. When the maid heard this, she suddenly became alarmed and said that actually, this ceremony starts tomorrow. Adriana, hearing this, was very surprised. She realized that the deadline was looming, but the dress was ready, so she could take her chances. Then, seeing Mistress's determined face, the maid said that she had no invitation to do so, and then she, hearing this, was incredibly surprised and did not understand how it could be so. The girl thought about the fact that this family was probably so unassuming that they were not even invited to such an event. And the girl had forgotten that she was no longer an archduchess. She pondered for a while. After that, she said that she needed to ask the count if there was any way to get there. So she asked the maid where he was at the moment. The maid was a little confused, but then said that the master had been in his study all this time and hadn't gone anywhere from there. Adriana only learned that the ceremony was taking place tomorrow. However, she wasn't sure whether Count Acacia had enough influence to receive an invitation to such an important event. Therefore, she decided not to hesitate. and immediately ran to his office to discuss the matter. But just as she ran past the hallway, she suddenly heard March's voice. She turned to her at once, very much in a concerned sort of way. Adriana immediately stopped and looked down. March said that they had received an invitation to the victory ceremony, and they were incredibly honored. The girl was very wary. Then she wondered why it had come only in the middle of the night. Marge ignored her questions, however, and said they had to get ready for tomorrow's banquet. She'd been working at this place for 30 years, but this was the first time she'd ever seen an invitation to such a great party. The other maids ran over to the head maid and scrutinized the invitation, but Adriana was still a little concerned. The girl wasn't sure if Noevian himself could have sent this invitation, but she realized that she wanted to hear everything personally from him, the whole truth without any secrets. Most of all, of course, she wants to know whether or not Blue is a mistress, and there's no way she's going to believe those rumors, because they could never be broken by the words of the others. Soon everything was ready, and the next day Adriana was dressed in an incredibly beautiful dress and walking under the arm with her husband. Count Acacia looked very tired. However, he was also dressed in an expensive suit. He turned to his wife and said that it was very late to talk about it, but he still asked if he had to go there at all. Adriana was very angry with him about it, and gave him an angry look, but said nothing. The man immediately understood, and said that of course he would go, but he trembled with fear. The girl, of course, understood perfectly well that it was difficult for him. However, she could not appear at such an important event without her partner. After all, they had been invited to the victory ceremony, and for such a family, it was an incredibly great honor. Even all the maids were overjoyed as they accompanied the girl on her way. Everyone was so excited, only because it was the first time such an event had ever happened, so the girl should definitely find out everything she wanted to know. After all, this event is a very good way to do it. Soon, one of the butlers said that Count Acacia and his beautiful wife were entering the hall. There were already quite a few noble and famous guests gathered at the event, and as soon as they entered the hall, the girl immediately began to look around. However, when she saw that no one was even paying attention to them, it pleased her. After all, they were not that interesting. All this time the guests were minding their own business and discussing some high topics. No one really paid attention to the Count and his wife. Suddenly seeing her husband's sad face, Adriana asked if he was really that worried. The man was really worried and said he was very worried. He told Adriana in his ear that if he suddenly passed out, he asked her to ignore him and just have a good time. When the girl heard this, she interjected, but when she saw his troubled face, she realized that apparently it could be true. So she asked him to just calm down and breathe deeply. Soon a bell suddenly rang to warn the guests. When Count Acacia heard it, he was ready to lose his consciousness. Adriana, for her part, immediately looked in the other direction and heard the butler announce that the rulers of the Great Rondo Empire were entering, His Majesty the Emperor and Her Majesties the Empress. The hope of the Empire, His Highness the Crown. Princes and the Crown Princess showed up next in line for the festivities, and at the very end enter the hall those who succeeded in demonstrating the strength of the Empire by defeating the rebels in the West. All the people were in anticipation, and even held their breath before His Majesty the Second Prince entered the hall. As soon as the man appeared in front of the people, the girls immediately squealed. They were very happy to see him, for the man had become incredibly handsome. Adriana, who was standing behind everyone so that no one would pay attention to her, recognized him immediately. But she was incredibly surprised that he had suddenly come to her grave when she died. Suddenly, the king of the empire turned to all the guests and said that he wanted all the guests to enjoy the joy of this great victory. People immediately began to raise their glasses up and shout various wishes for the empire, as well as congratulating the winner on this achievement. However, the prince suddenly looked somewhere in the crowd and didn't take his eyes off her for a while. Adriana immediately thought that he must have noticed her in the crowd, so she was a little wary. After that, he began at once to descend from the top of the stairs or to walk into the crowd. Adriana covered herself with a fan and stood behind her husband's back, for she realized that they had crossed glances. However, as soon as the girl noticed him coming closer and closer, she realized that he was probably coming towards her, but she really hoped he wouldn't because now was not the best moment to do so. At this moment, the guests immediately noticed both the girl and the prince. They thought that His Highness probably wanted to ask her to dance, but they didn't understand who this miss was at all. But to Adriana's delight, a man stopped nearby and asked one of the girls to dance. Immediately the music started playing and they began to dance merrily.